You folks ever have that happen to you where you're working on something and you step away from it, whether you gotta go eat or go for a walk or you just sleep on it overnight, and then you come back to it and it's almost like your excitement meter on the project has been recharged? It's not even that the potential outcome of the project has changed or anything else. I just think it's the distance makes the heart grow fonder kind of effect that applies to our work and the stuff that we decide to work on. Well, I did that, except for a 30-minute lunch break. It's been over a year since the last interview episode of the Repertoire podcast. Oops. But in all seriousness, I gotta say, the gusto I'm bringing back to these episodes, I struggle to even put it into words. We've got new thumbnails on YouTube. We're just about to crack 1,000 subscribers on the Repertoire YouTube channel. Shout out if you're already subscribed there. We are nearly 200,000 all-time downloads on this podcast. I think that's absolutely bonkers. I'm working really, really hard to get some incredibly cool guests for you folks in the coming months. And so this show has never had seasons, right? I've never really had clear enough checkpoints or markers in the life cycle of this podcast. It's just one long infinite game for me. And if I if I had to plant a flag, episode 167, this very episode, is a significant one. And so my guest today, Chef Eddie Shepard, killed it in this conversation. We cover so much interesting ground across getting experience in restaurants, skill stacking, and how he's been able to make more money in his business, a lot of which was self-taught, believe it or not, and some strategies around how he accomplished that. We even cut into his prep time at the end because we could not help ourselves from nerding out about productivity tactics that Eddie uses to accomplish 12-course tasting menu pop-ups by himself. No other employees, no front of house, no food runners, no commis running around, just him. And so if, as you're listening to these episodes, if you're the type to leave when the rapid fire questions start, consider yourself warned that there is a little treasure chest of value just at the end of this episode. Quick disclaimer, yes, this was recorded in March of 2023. As I referenced, it's been over a year since I've hosted an interview. And so a few of the points that I bring up about my upcoming pop-up is beyond old news at this point. But as with most episodes of this podcast, the content is designed to stand the test of time. And this conversation is no different. It is so good to be back with you folks. If you want to help this show grow, do not forget to rate the show on Apple Podcasts, on Spotify. Take the 9 seconds it takes to click the subscribe button on YouTube. And this is like an interesting value prop that you get from doing that. You get teaser clips from other interviews before you invest your time in a full episode. So I scour the internet to try to find, like esoteric people doing cool stuff. And I know that that's a risk. I know that I'm not bringing on the Rene Redzepis and the David Changs of the world onto this show quite yet. And so if you want to just get a sense of, do I get some value from this? Is this worth the hour, 45 minutes? The clips are a great way to do that. And you can get those clips on the YouTube channel. I would also be remiss if I didn't mention the fact that the reason that the show has been growing is because you folks have been sharing it. And so if there's a point in this conversation or any of the episodes where you want to take advantage of the share button that's available in whatever podcast catcher that you're listening to these episodes on, please do so. Hit that share button, send it to a friend, tell them why you're interested in this podcast, and we can just get more people listening. I think that would be really, really cool. And so now let's talk to Eddie Shepard. Eddie, thanks so much for coming on the show. It's great to have you with us.
Oh, it's a pleasure.
One of the main reasons I wanted to talk to you is that my intuition tells me that you and I actually have more in common with each other than you might think. So we have experience in restaurants, and then we have pop-ups, and then we have media production and growing an audience and consulting projects. Our progression has a lot of these mirrored qualities, but I hope in this conversation we can find some differences that might help the listener. So to start, I've seen in your content that you've shared that you've got over a decade in restaurants under your belt. Yeah. How did you go about getting your first position in a restaurant?
Yeah, so I mean, more than that now. I would say it's getting on close to 17 years in restaurants. I think I started when I was a student, like pay my way through university. I would, quite a typical route, at least over here. I wonder if it's the same in the US, where you start washing pots and then a chef phones in sick, and before you know it, you're on the line with no idea what's going on.
Yeah. What type of restaurant was that?
So the first place that I was up in Scotland studying, so it would have been like, there was a busy little bistro that I worked in, and then for a little bit, this is nuts looking back because it seemed normal at the time, for a bit I worked in a castle, in a cafe, this Scottish castle
and things.
Yeah, it was mad. You would take your break and you'd go out and like sit on like the these huge ancient walls looking out over the Scottish countryside. It's just, at the time you're just like, oh yeah, that's just my break. Looking back, It's crazy.
I guess, what positions, like, keep going on that. Like, so you get that first experience, and then I guess, was that something where you had a little bit of a hard time catching on, or you struggled with like your interest level there, or keep going on that experience, and how did you go from restaurant to restaurant?
So initially, I mean, at first it was kind of, it was quite accidental, and it was like, but cooking, having been given this job doing basic cooking, that was much more interesting than washing pots. And then sort of over the course of a year or two, I started getting more and more into that. And I think, like a lot of people, you get quite hooked on the adrenaline of service and the buzz and this, very immediate feedback loop of like, if you have a good shift, you really know you've had a good shift. If stuff goes wrong, you really know it's gone wrong. And when I graduated, then I did a philosophy degree, and I had no idea what I was going to do afterwards. And by the time I graduated, I was really starting to get pretty hooked in on cooking at that point. I just sort of thought, you know what, well, I'll figure out what I'm going to do. I'm going to do this I'll do this for a year, maybe 2 years, sort of figure out what's coming next. And at the end of that 2 years, I hadn't really committed in any direction, but I was really enjoying being in the kitchen. And my mum sort of said to me when I was chatting to her about like not being sure what to do, she was like, well, if you're enjoying this so much, why don't you give it one more year and really push it, see what you can do with it, don't just kind of drift through. And I did, and I very immediately found that once I just went that extra bit deeper into it and started kind of pursuing it a bit more seriously, suddenly the more you're putting in, again, quite quickly you see that coming back to you. You're learning more, you're getting promoted up through the ranks and stuff, and that really was the beginning of it being sort of quite addictive, really, I guess.
What were you like as a line cook? Like, do you have any? I mean, this audience particularly likes the difficult days of service, days where you didn't really necessarily feel like you were going to make it, or maybe potential days where someone in your career, whether that you would call them a mentor, actually came in and taught you something that still sticks with you to this day. The listener really likes those stories, so I was curious if there were any that stand out.
I don't think my strength has ever been particularly as a strong line cook. I think
Interesting.
I think early on I had a good aptitude for being in the kitchen. So I think I got quite quickly kind of promoted into cooking and stuff. But when I started being in like busier restaurants, there was always people, like I was never the fastest, never the best in service. Always more like I was fine, but I would get like some guys are just so fast and so cool all the way through service, and that is not me, unfortunately. But then because of that, you kind of figure out your own place. So that was one of the things that got me, I was quite interested in like techniques and the creative side of cooking and these sorts of things. And what I did find is that from this background, like studying, like I was quite good at sitting down and absorbing like a lot of information and kind of processing that in a way that some of the other chefs I worked with just maybe weren't so interested in that stuff. So through that, I think I kind of found that was a bit more of a strength for me, and to maybe lean into that. And I mean, I don't know again what it's like. I've never worked in the US, but I found the kitchens I worked in were largely pretty supportive. So even if you weren't the strongest line cook, like people were generally pretty good at playing to each other's strengths. So no one wanted to see someone else like go under during service, So you'd give people a little lift if they needed it, and likewise, the other things that I was like, the things where I was stronger, I would try and give other people a lift. So
I think it depends on the caliber of the environment. You know what I mean? Like if it's a bistro like you're talking about, or if it's like high-end tasting menu place, or even the menus that you're doing now, like it increases and decreases the margin of error that you can have.
Sure.
And then also I find with scale, you have that same, it's kind of like you could have two axes that we could plot this stuff on. And as you go up in scale, I think that there's like also a little bit of a higher margin for error versus if you and I do a pop-up and we're only serving 12 people, you know what I mean? Like there's a little bit less there. And just by the nature of, I've staged in a couple of restaurants where like stations weren't actually run by one person. They were like 2 or 3 person, kind of like pods or teams that would work on a station to do stuff together. And I can imagine that's much easier than just everything's on your shoulders. You're the chef of the station.
Sure. I mean, I think most of the places I worked in, I was mainly in smaller restaurants and smaller teams. Like I think most of the places I worked, we were maybe 5 chefs on shift would be like the maximum number you'd have. So you're always quite small, quite tight teams. Like, some of the later places I worked before I went completely sort of freelance and doing, I started like launch my own thing that I'm doing now, were such small teams that you became so close with those people. Like, they're some of my best friends now because you're just, in each other's pockets, and we're extremely lucky that we got on so well. It wouldn't have worked otherwise, I think.
I don't know if you feel the same way here, but I get a bit fearful when I hear that folks are opting to skip restaurant experience and just go into starting a YouTube channel or just go into writing a cookbook, because I personally give so much credit to what I see as my domain expertise and the genuine skill set that I've been able to develop. That's all come from restaurants. And so even in my courses, like, I specifically design them to be taken alongside restaurant experience, because I don't want to dissuade people from going and getting that experience, because it's like the volume and the feedback and the pace that you get in those environments that sets the standard for the projects that you want to kind of do down the line, or it gives you that strong foundation. So my question to you is, have you seen a better alternative to working in restaurants yet, or is that still the crucible by which, great cooking is developed?
Yeah, that's really interesting. Like, because even I think it was really important for me, and like you're saying, it gave me a foundation that I entirely rely on. Even now, if I'm cooking some stuff that on the face of it might not relate to anything I was doing at the start, that the sort of the fundamentals, like work ethic, working clean, like that fast knife skills, all of these things, and just seasoning, like how the amount of dishes, like when you're working in a restaurant, the amount of times you have seasoned and tasted food, and that sheer repetition to get that bang on consistently, and to be able to just taste something now and know, not necessarily have to sit and even be analytical about it. What direction you need to take it. And I'm sure that people can get great at cooking without working in restaurants, but being a good cook and being a good chef are slightly different skill sets, I think. Though obviously complementary, and also sometimes I think some of the practicalities, like I sometimes speak to people who are very passionate about food and sometimes have some really interesting ideas and are really into learning stuff, but that restaurant experience gives you a very practical head about certain things as well, right? Because you can come up with something creative and interesting and technical, but if you're doing service, if you're still doing like a restaurant service or pop-ups or whatever it is, you've also got to know, how do I batch this? How is this going to be practical to do? What's the mise en place going to be like? Am I going to, and again, even now doing food that I think most people would consider from the outside to be quite complex, and it's quite a long tasting menu that I do. But in fact, even more because of that, like understanding how to break down prep lists and do mise en place and kind of take all the romance out of that stuff and break it down into practicalities is utterly vital, especially because for me, a lot of the guests I have, so the reservations here for the tasting menu are booked up about 6 months in advance. So when people come, which is great. It's a really privileged position to be in. But that means they've been waiting at least 6 months since they booked, and however long before that if they were trying to book. So when they come, I can't be like, oh, today I didn't quite figure out how to get this dish right, or something went wrong. And but like, it's like you have to be able to really nail consistency with that stuff, because otherwise it's just not. It's not fair to them. It's not fair for the price point you're at. And yeah, I think restaurants are like a crucial sort of training ground for that stuff.
Well, because if you just think about what you just said, like you have this idea that you want to put into the world, and you have real people who are coming and paying for it and having expectations. And if the first time that you're going to experience any sort of those logistical headaches is going to be under your own name, under your own project, of course you're going to struggle.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of people look at experience in restaurants as like, oh, well, it's so grueling, it's so hard and whatever. But like, you and I just talked about incredible camaraderie. We talked about the skill set that we were able to develop. And it's like, oh, wait, and you get paid to get that experience?
Yeah.
Like, if you really think about it, anytime that you can learn something on someone else's dime, it's a benefit to you as the recipient of that knowledge.
Yeah.
And so I don't know, like I'm such a a restaurant stan, and it makes me upset when I see people kind of like, oh well, no, you don't need to do that, or like, oh well, we've
Yeah.
created this thing, and all you need to do is watch these videos, and then you're gonna be fine.
Yeah.
It's like, well, I don't have enough examples that prove that is not the case.
And I'm sure there's people that like book the trend for this stuff too, or can find a particular way into things. But even though, like, a lot of what I learned outside of restaurants too, and I would be, when I was working in restaurants, I was then often, I was doing additional stuff on my days off or before or after shifts and stuff, and that a lot of that has been like completely crucial to what I'm doing now too. But I just don't think I would sacrifice that at least, like I say, I probably did 15 years in restaurants. I sort of started, like maybe even 18 years ago, but at least doing a couple, of years of like a couple to just see how stuff works. Or maybe even part-time might be enough if you were doing something else at the same time, but just some of that real life experience.
Yeah, there's like a minimum effective dose almost, because you're right. I see that. I see people on the complete other side of it. They're like, Justin, I really want to do my own thing, and so I'm going to commit to 5 years at this place. I have dedicated the next 10 years of my life into restaurants, and then I'm going to think about that. And it's like, it's a completely arbitrary duration. Like there's no basis for why you chose 7 years in restaurants or why you chose 10 years at this place. And yeah, I just don't think you and I can probably be a testament to this. Like 1 year in a restaurant, there's like some time dilation or warping that's happening, right? Because it's like experience-wise to another industry, you're getting like 3 years worth of what someone in marketing might consider experience. I just think it's so interesting.
3 times those hours, right? Like
totally, exactly.
You do a bunch of 16-hour. You do a 16-hour day. Most people are working an 8 or 9 hour day, at least over here, for a full-time job. So you really are like double it up.
Totally. Like, and I mean, if you even think about there were studies that come out that say like the average office worker only works like between 3 and 5 hours in an 8-hour day. And there's none of that like, well, I wonder if they're working over there on their station. It's like, no. So maybe it's triple. Maybe if we're really like breaking down the math, it's triple. That's so interesting.
And the confidence I think that gives you too, because there is no like that you can't cheat that. You can't accidentally, you're not going to like accidentally float through a career like that. Like if you can thrive in that environment, or even if the environment doesn't suit you and you want to get out and do something else, if you know that you can write a prep list, you can bang through your mise en place, you know that you are like, you have a base level skill that even if people then, whatever you go on to do, don't get it at first, you can be like, well, I have a skill set I know to be of a certain level. And I've seen a couple of people, I think, do interesting things where they perhaps have had like an expertise in a cuisine, or they've been interested in doing a very particular thing, and then wanted to launch that, and then decided to go like, well, I'm going to do this thing, but even though I know I'm kind of an expert in my field already, I'm going to go and do a year in restaurants before I do my independent thing. And again, I think that's very sound too. And again, I'm sure there are people who can do it without that, but I think as a general rule, my advice would be get that experience, I think.
So this is kind of a leading statement, but I'm curious why you left restaurants. I mostly want to know, was there a single moment where you realized that things needed to change, or was it just kind of like a slow burn of learning new things and seeing other examples, and then you eventually made the leap?
Sure. I think I knew what food I ultimately wanted to do, and there wasn't really a place for me to do that at the time. So I think potentially I would have continued with a more conventional sort of career path if there had been, because what I do is plant-based food in this tasting menu form, and kind of at the modernist end of things, I would guess. Although that's not necessarily typically how I think of it, but if we pigeonhole it as something like that. And yeah, at the time, there wasn't anywhere, like I reached a point where there wasn't someone to go and do that for, at least over here in the UK. And so I kind of was like, well, to keep learning, to keep progressing towards the thing I want to do, I'm going to have to do more of this on my own. And so it sort of happened quite naturally, really. Like I never quite got to the point that I like completely burnt out on restaurants and was like, no, that's it, I'm going in one big dramatic like stage. It was more like this tipping point between the stuff I was doing in my like as almost like as a second job, really. I'd started doing some consulting, I was doing some pop-ups and stuff, and then you just get to this point where you're like, okay, the balance between these things is going to shift now, and I'm going to go more onto that. And then suddenly that's what you're doing all the time. And which again, I'm kind of glad I did that way too, because it meant there wasn't immediate 100% pressure on the stuff I was doing of my own for it to work like perfectly straight away, or for it to be fully booked immediately. You know, I didn't have that same financial pressure.
Such a good piece of advice, because there is that school of thought, the burn the boat strategy, you know, like just don't give yourself another option and then you will have nothing but focus. But I don't know, man, I think there's just too many examples of like short-term behavior that happens, or burnout, or you take a risk and now you're in a bunch of debt for some reason, or you screw over a business partner and then you have a bad reputation in the city that you're in. And it's just like, I did the same thing. It was like, my story is like, I went from Michelin kitchens to working on a food truck when I moved to Seattle because I wanted to start my YouTube channel and my podcast. And it was like, I could do part-time. I could keep my hands in food. I could just pay enough money to, you know, make enough money to pay my bills. And so, yeah, I'm a huge advocate of that strategy. But what stands out to me, and I'm curious if you struggled with this too, did you ever run into like sunk cost or worrying about what your previous coworkers would kind of like think or say? And I guess maybe speak to the person who is in that role that you were in. They're working in restaurants. They're thinking about potentially doing something else. And they're like, well, I have all this experience. Like, people know me as this, but now I'm seeing that these are, you know, higher financial upside, more learning for me, more progress. Can you speak to that person?
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, I think people should do what suits them, because of course there is also like, I love what I get to do now, but I'm sure like everyone who is doing their own thing does, every now and again you have a day where you think, God, wouldn't it be nice to just work for a wage and not have to think about like whether 100%. It's like planning all this stuff. And obviously that's the minority, and most of the time you just like, you get to pick your own you get to be self-directing. But you know, and I'm sure that doesn't suit everyone, that like either that's the way they want to work. Some people would want a different type of security for it. I think it's probably going to be easier to imagine for people now, because even 5 years ago, or certainly 10 years ago, to look for examples of people taking a less conventional route rather than like work your way up the ranks, you know, get some investment, open your own place, like there were just less examples to look for of people doing that. And now I think whether you look at pop-ups, food trucks, like online stuff, like there's so many examples of different directions you can take stuff. So I would hope that people can sort of more immediately imagine it. I mean, there were times that I would as well, like some of the restaurants I worked in at the time when I was basically working 2 jobs and I was doing like consulting and stuff, like maybe 12 years ago or something, I was writing a blog at the same time as I was working in a restaurant, and I would write up like recipes that I was working on or techniques. And it was sort of at the time that like restaurants like Alinea were sort of putting out their early sort of YouTube videos, and I would try and figure out what they're doing and stuff. And at the time, like some of the chefs I worked with would, you know, like take the piss of that and like what are you doing? Fondly, I think, and lightheartedly, but also then you see down the line like that stuff pay off in one way or another, because you're learning these skills you maybe don't even realize you're learning at the time. You're starting to learn like stuff on the computers, like how to write, how to engage with people in a different way, like things like photography and video stuff. I'm not suggesting that all chefs should learn this or consider it a crucial part of their skill set necessarily, but if you ever come to launch your own thing, a little bit of an understanding of how to take some decent photographs and some video clips and maybe work with a camera is like, God, it'll help you. Like, it'll make things so much easier. Even if you don't want to do YouTube and you don't want to do a lot of social media and stuff, like, you just save money because you're not going to have to pay someone to do this stuff for you, you know? Yeah.
The drum that I pound there is, you might not be the head videographer or the recipe writer of whatever concept you want to launch in the future, but having an understanding of how to do that thing will allow you to evaluate the performance of the person that you hire. Because if you have no idea what being in an editing timeline feels like, you're going to get completely, the wool's going to be pulled over your eyes with the person who you're working with, because they're going to say, well, it's going to take around 6 weeks for me to get this edit back to you.
Yeah,
and it's like, if you've spent time editing that type of project, you're like, hey, hold on. That's not right. Like, this is a 60-second Instagram reel. Like, why is it 6 weeks? But for the person who has no concept of what this thing is, it's just going to be completely over their head.
And vice versa to that as well, I guess. Like, if someone is thinking, oh, I'm going to leave restaurants and then I'm going to start putting up YouTube videos and that's going to help launch my thing. They should probably get a quick sense of how long it might take to edit a longer YouTube video, especially something like a recipe video, because the idea that that also is easier than working in it, like, it's not necessary. It's different, you know, it's less physical, but it's like the amount of time, if someone's not done it before, the amount of time they imagine it's going to take to do something more long form like that, they should maybe double or triple it.
You mentioned the word consulting a couple times so far, and I find that most chefs don't seek out their first consulting gig by themselves. They usually get approached. I certainly had that happen to me. Once I did it, though, I saw the fact that I could make a lot more money. I could work with really cool people on really cool projects, not put in so many hours, and I was just hooked. I loved consulting, and I still do consulting style projects. Do you have any advice for the person who's listening and just gotten that first DM or that first email and saying, hey, we saw that you worked on XYZ. We'd love to ask you questions about XYZ that we're trying to do. How should maybe speak from a chef's perspective first? How should they be thinking about it?
Yeah, well, one of the things that I think I found useful, I wish I'd known a bit more confidently earlier, was that, like, you shouldn't worry about the thing you're being asked to do being, like, just out of your comfort zone, just out of your experience. Like, if it's a long way out, then perhaps have a little worry. But, like, you don't know how to do this stuff until you are doing it. So long as you're willing to put in, like, time and over deliver on what people are asking you to do, if they ask you to, like, some of the first stuff I had to do was, like, write up techniques and recipes for, like, newer equipment that was coming in at the time. So we're talking, like, at the point where, like, water baths were becoming, you know, sort of really just becoming more popular. I would have to do things like recipes for them, techniques using the cream whippers and stuff. And I was using these things, but I was early days with it, really. But if you commit to saying, yeah, I can do that for you, like, you're going to learn to do it by doing it as well. So I don't mean by that people should, like, blindly, overconfidently say they can do stuff that they haven't got any experience in or can't do. But if something is just like, okay, I think I have a grip on this, but I've not worked in this way before, so long as you feel you can commit to being like, I'm going to learn how to do this, I'm going to figure this out, I'm going to put in, if it takes twice as much of my time as it should at the start, like, I think, you know, again, it's an educational experience for you. And that, I guess, is the other thing that I would suggest to people is, like, to always consistently aim to over deliver on what you're, like, saying you're going to do. Don't be like, when it's under your name and it's consulting and or it's your own projects or whatever, even if it means that you're having to charge more. There's a great quote that I heard where someone was saying, like, you should charge what's appropriate. You should charge and something be expensive, but it be expensive, and then you still over deliver on that. You still give them more value than that, you know, that amount. So that, I think, is a good, those things I often have in mind, you know.
Well, the person is approaching you because they think you're an asset to what they're potentially working on. It's not just like they just, like, pulled out an old phone book and just, like, threw a dart at the page. Like, you're being reached out to for some aspect of your experience. It's not necessarily. I think about, like, the job of TikTok strategist 4 years ago was, like, not a job. Yeah. But people started getting paid a lot to do that, not by nature of a degree that they had or any sort of, you know, other credentials. It was just probably because they managed to do something that mapped towards somebody else's goal of growing on XYZ platform. And then the funny thing about this is, to your point, when you do more work in this industry, you're reaching the exponential end of that curve, because it's like you're not only doing it, but you're getting paid to do it, and you're getting paid to almost experiment and kind of present your findings, and you're becoming an expert in that just by virtue of saying yes to the consulting project, especially if it's new. With old stuff, that is what it is.
And I think the other thing that people perhaps don't always think about at the start is depending on what it is you're being asked to do, like, half of your job can be almost to act as a translator between, like, you know, if you've got experience in restaurants like we were talking about before, and then you're talking to people that want to, say, sell stuff to people in restaurants, but they've not worked shifts on that. They don't know what's useful in a busy service. They don't know what chefs will want to know about an ingredient or a piece of equipment or a piece of software or something. So, you know, a big part of what you're doing is perhaps practical and saying, here's how this would work. But half of it is maybe just saying to them, no, people aren't going to care about this thing that you think is important. That's not gonna be important to chefs. But this other thing, the fact that this makes their workflow easier, the fact this makes, knocks a job off the mise en place, or means this is something that they don't have to actively watch during service. Oh, that'll be super. It might not sound as sexy, but that'll be super interesting and important to chefs.
There's a creator I follow named Justin Moore, and he does a bunch of content on getting sponsors for your content. And he has this great piece of advice where he shares with people that one of the biggest competitive advantages you can have in being a creator that works with brands is being responsive on email. And I'm curious if there are any, just because of, I'll give a little bit of context there, because a lot of these brands reach out to these creators who are just like unorganized to the nines. They can't seem to like get their life together. And so the brand who reaches out to someone who is just super responsive, even if they have a smaller audience, they're probably more likely to get chosen for that campaign just by nature of the fact that they actually genuinely responded and they were nice to work with and whatever. I guess in consulting, for the person who is relatively new at it, do you have any practices that you follow that are just like, these allow me to either have more peace of mind or work with clients in a more productive way? What do you do now that you've just kind of built over time when you do a consulting project?
Sure. I guess... So at the moment, so much of my time is taken up with the tasting menu. I do relatively little consulting now. It's sort of bridged more of a period for me. And a lot of that was with longer standing relationships. So I would work with a particular company or a particular person for over a longer period of time. But then the things that would sort of pop up, I mean, that in itself is valuable, being able to have these like just good relationships with companies, and they will want to work with you if you are easy to work with and responsive, and they know you over deliver on things. Then that, that's one of the values in that stuff, is to see things as more long term. And then I always struggled more with these like one-off things, because it's so hard to know where to pitch it. Like, is this what you should be asking about as a fee, what the expectations would be? I think getting stuff really clear up front is really good. And a very helpful piece of advice that I was given as a way of doing that was to give those people a couple of options. So if they got in touch with you and say, we'd like you to do this, then you can get back in touch and say, okay, well, let me give you these 3 versions of what I could do for you then. Like the sort of the cheaper, quick version, the middle version that's like, okay, I'm going to do a bit more work. It's going to maybe cost a little bit more. And then perhaps a top tier version that's you like pushing towards the top end of what you might want to charge. But also you're saying, this is me giving you like really everything I can give you in terms of time, expertise. Like, this is me making this my number one priority. And then they can pick from that. And then you're both on the same page, you know how to judge it. They know if they go for a cheaper, less time consuming option, then they know it's probably not your number one priority in that case. You, again, still try and over deliver on that a bit, but like that I've found helpful just to get things straight at the start.
One thing that also helps me as a tip for the listener here is that if a client comes to you and says, well, we want this one, but we don't want to pay that price. Like, we want to pay a little bit less. The advice that really helped me is to never just say yes to that as an inquiry. So let's say that you have 6 dot points that you have included for Y price. If the brand comes and says, we want those 6 dot points, but we don't want to pay whatever Y price is, I would take away a dot point or change the deadline, like the quickness that I will deliver that dot point on, and give that better price to the client, because then you still get the gig.
Yeah.
But then you are making sure that it is reflective of a change in the quality of, you know what I mean? And it's maybe not the quality, but it's like the level of execution that you're providing to the person. Because otherwise, what you do there is you have kind of put your flag in the ground and said, respect my rates, basically, as a consultant.
It's a level of it's a level of professionalism, and it's also should inspire some confidence in them that you're like, I know what my time is worth, I know what my expertise is worth. Totally. This is what it is, and I want to work with you. So here's options and ways we can do it. But also, I'm not going to just be low. But if someone was trying to like crunch down like your price and stuff, maybe you don't want to be working with them so badly anyway.
100%. I want to pivot to talking about media production, because, man, your aesthetics in the stuff that you produce is off the charts, man.
Oh, thank you.
in your photos, in your videos. Where did you learn that?
So that's very kind of you. That's all kind of self-taught, really, I guess. This is one of the things where I was beginning to perhaps learn some of these things before I really knew they might be valuable later. So, like I say, sort of perhaps 12 years or so ago, taking some food pictures to put up on a blog that probably hardly anyone was reading was like the beginnings of learning how to use a very, very cheap bad camera. And then like about 4 or 5 years ago, so I did a couple of digital cookbooks and I photographed them, and like because there wasn't another option. I didn't have a budget for anyone else to do them. I was like, everything was being made just me, but again, at the time, that means I wasn't making the money back on them, I don't think, for my time. But now looking back at it, it was this big educational period for me where I was learning how to do that stuff. You know, I would not do a lot of it the same way now, but it was giving me a foundation. And so about 3 years ago, like just before the pandemic, I remember thinking again, I'd published a print cookbook by that point, and I knew I could push photography and stuff. I wanted to kind of up it another level. So I invested in a slightly better camera, like had some nice lenses, and like, not that that stuff is important. People shouldn't worry too much about that, I don't think. But I was at the stage where, so perhaps this is good for people to know. Basically, I had Canon's cheapest like DSLR camera and their cheapest Nifty 50 lens for like 10 years, and published digital books with that and a print cookbook with that and filmed early YouTube stuff with that. You know, it was only once I'd done that stuff that I was like, okay, I'm going to get myself a more professional level camera and lens, and was beginning to get more into that. And then the pandemic happened, and I think like for a lot of people, you just suddenly, both your time commitments change and what you want. You know, you also start to think, okay, maybe it would not be too bad to have another string to my bow. So yeah, I kind of just self-taught on that stuff, but I wanted to try and make it as nice as I can, you know.
You mentioned that you wouldn't have done things the way that you did them. What if you had to go back, what would you have changed?
I think I guess I know more about like things like photography now. So I think I was sometimes struggling around with like lights and backdrops and stuff for things, and now 95% of the time I'm just like natural light coming through a window, a nice table or stone or something. Like, I'm not trying to like light everything perfectly so there's no shadows and stuff, or like, but also some of that comes with confidence and knowing what you've done enough that you know what your results are going to be like, and you know, kind of like things like using like indirect, like nice soft window light. So a lot of those things, like, I kind of could have made my life easier, and I think in some ways I was overcomplicating things because like I was shooting on a tripod a lot as well, which again, most of the time I kind of don't bother now. I just think I would rather be able to, and this is one of the things I wanted to improve on, and one of the reasons I wanted to improve is because I wanted to be able to, when I'm busy in the kitchen, be able to like pick up my camera, grab it when I've got a couple of minutes, and know that I could get a nice, usable, good photo, and I'm not like going to have to faff around and figure out what to do and take 100 photos. That I could like get a good image pretty quickly, which again I think is, you know, not a bad skill for chefs to practice, and not hard to learn really, again with YouTube and stuff. In fact, I've got a video on like food photography. They can go and watch that. That's
It's linked in the show notes. I mean, you see the same thing with video, man. Like you'll the common aphorism that, you know, veteran YouTubers talk about is that you should go audio first, then lighting, then get a camera. And it's so funny because everybody does it in the reverse. They get a new fancy camera body, they get excited, and they're like, well, I don't really like the performance, and they watch a tutorial, and they're like, oh, cool, I need a light. And it's like, well, my videos still aren't getting views, and it's like, well, because you're using the onboard microphone that your camera has, horrible. And nobody's going to sit through your 16-minute YouTube video when the audio's not good. And what's so funny about that parallel is I think it maps to food as well. Like you see people who launch their first menu or they make a first dish and there's 13 components on it. And it's like, well, I think you're doing a little bit of a cover up for these other things that you feel are lacking in your skill set or your technique or whatever. And so, yeah, that's funny that you say all of that.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great parallel. Like that's exactly it. Often like doing things visually with food, with all of this stuff, like it again, not 100% rule. I'm sure there's things that like buck this trend, but it often is kind of like it often masks a lack of confidence in what you're doing. Like certainly with food, one of the things I like to really aim at is kind of having like 2-3 things on a dish if I can, like
100%.
and feel like I'm like I know those are right.
What I had to kind of come face to face with is the fact that there are behind the camera skills. I did a lot of freelance videography projects when I moved to Seattle because I really wanted to get better at those behind the camera skills.
So that must have been a good way to learn.
It was awesome. I mean, because you have clients that are, kind of like asking for things that you've never done before. You have event recaps where it's like, if you and I are shooting a video and we mess something up, we can just do it again. But at an event, it's like you have one shot to get this right. And so you're really forced to just, really get intimate with your gear and really understand how it works and different range of environments. I don't have control over the lighting. All of these sorts of things are really, really valuable. So that's behind the camera skills. But what people don't often account for is like there's in front of the camera skills as well. So which was harder for you to develop, the being on camera or the being behind the camera?
Probably being on camera. I don't think I'm there yet with it. But I think the stuff behind the camera, you can sort of, to a certain degree, you can work through like a tick list, so you can learn stuff like what frame rate you should be using and, like what shutter speed you should be using for what frame rate and things like that. There are facts that you can learn and there are principles that you can work from. With being on camera, I think you just have to make yourself do it, and bit by bit you get more comfortable. And like I look back at the first YouTube videos I did and I'm not sure what I'm trying to, like, I think I'm trying to be myself, but I don't know how to present that, and it's bit by bit is becoming more natural, and I'm not quite there with it yet. I'm not quite where I want to be, where it's just like us just chatting. That's the aim, is to get to that, but also also be sort of hitting all the points you want to hit. I think you have to put out some bad stuff in order to get comfortable in front of the camera. I think you just have to like accept that it is not going to be great straight away. But the way you're going to learn is by making stuff and like putting it out and putting yourself in front of the camera more and more. And also like not thinking of it in a kind of either in an ego or self-conscious way. You just kind of have to be like, it's just going to go out there. It's just part of what I'm doing. It's not like, I'm not necessarily always going to feel, I'm not going to feel great about myself afterwards. I'm also not going to like torture myself over it not being perfect, because it's all part of the learning process.
I want to pivot and talk about pop-ups for a bit, because there are a bunch of folks listening who either get excited about the idea of doing pop-ups or they're like deep in the dirt, they're elbow deep in their pop-up hosting kind of experience. So I guess maybe start with the origin story of why decide to do pop-ups, and maybe even some resources that were helpful for you in those early days.
How did I even start with them? I started with a couple of mates and a friend from like an old friend from school, basically, like a really good friend who I like was very close with, and then we sort of lost touch for a few years, and then weirdly got back in touch because it turned out we were both working in restaurants really near each other, having not been either of us been chefs when we were first friends. And another chef friend that I worked in a restaurant with, and we just all got on really well. Like we would go for drinks and chat about food stuff, and it came about, I think just directly out of that we were like, wouldn't it be cool if we did this? And so we did it as a little group. The three of us came up with a menu. I think we did it so we did like a couple of dishes each. We weren't even trying to like be as fully meshed together and collaborative as like working on the dishes together. It's like each of us brings a couple of dishes. But that was really good because you had this support network there, and you had other people that like, if I didn't know how to do something, someone else would know how. If, again, when one of my mate found the venue we were going to do stuff in, I had some more experience using like Eventbrite, so I set that side of stuff up. That was really great to have other people to like lean on during those first versions of things. And yeah, I think we were just treating it as fun too. Like we knew we covered our costs and then made some profit off it, and we did it a few times, but it was not, certainly at the time, we weren't thinking of it as like a business venture. It was like cooking with my mates, doing something really fun, which again, quite a nice like gentle way to start out. And like I think I don't think everyone has to start out that way either. I think you probably could go into it straight away with a more businessy mindset, but I don't know, for me it was really nice knowing there were just other people that I could like sound ideas off as well, and like that were supportive there. Like when you were doing it, did you go straight out on your own, or did you have a mate to go
Yeah, I no, I did my first few by myself, but then very quickly I had someone who he was one of my line cooks, and we went to school together, and
Nice.
he then moved to Seattle, and we started cooking together, which was huge and pivotal. And then ultimately I ended up finding a business partner who owned an event production company. So that's kind of the
Nice.
direction that I took it, where it was I really disliked the putting up the ticket page, having to market the
Sure.
thing, trying to find an audience. And this business partner of mine was just like, she was so good at sales. She was
Yeah.
so good at these like corporate relationships. And so it was like the dream gig for me, because I could basically be told, hey, there's 40 people at this venue, and they want this type of menu, and then all I got to do was lean into my strengths and do what I did best, which was write a menu and execute it. And so it was, the dream kind of relationship
Yeah,
from
that's
from
very
from that
cool.
side.
Uh,
Yeah.
yeah, sorry, that's a real.
No
I
worries.
love the Thermomix, but it's a real design flaw that, like, when it finishes, it just keeps, it'll just
Just
keep
keeps
pinging.
It's got to remind you that it's done. That's
Yeah.
so funny. So for the listener, Eddie just had to go off of frame and stop the Thermomix from beeping, because you're like in the heat of prep. And so I had this funny question that I wanted to ask you, which was, if we were to get off this conversation and I was where you are, and we got to go into the kitchen together, and we were, you were giving me kind of a tour of what your setup looks like. What are some practices or systems or routines that you have in place for your pop-ups that might either surprise the listener or might be useful for the listener to know that you've developed in your logistics?
Sure. Well, I tell you, I'll give you like a very quick outline of like a bare bones outline of what my setup is like. So I do tasting menu services here on this is the converted bottom floor of our home. And when we bought the house, I knew this is what I was going to do. So it works like a little restaurant basically. I do either 3 or 4 tables, 8 covers a night, 3 weekends of the month, and I do like a 12-course tasting menu. It's always like the no choice for the diners. They come and they get the tasting menu. So that simplifies things a ton. I'm not having to think all the food goes out at the same time. Like I introduce it all to the guests all at the same time. Like I don't go table to table. So there's a bunch of things like this where it's very stripped back in terms of logistics, and I couldn't do it any other way. But because it's so stripped back on that front, on the food side, I feel like it gives me tons of freedom. So a big part of what I do here is trying to make everything that I can pretty much from scratch. So right behind me, we've got the Rotovap that I use
I was going
for
to ask, is
vacuum
that a
distilling.
rotovap? Yeah, that's
Yeah, so
great.
you don't see them in a lot of homes typically. Yeah. So I use that for distilling. I make a low temperature distilled gin with that. I use it for some items on the menu where I'll do some low temperature reductions, and I make things like hydrosols that I use in marinades. So, if people aren't familiar with hydrosols, things like, rose water's a sort of hydrosol, sort of distilled aromatic water. But once you have access to things like this, you can start doing, all kinds of things. I don't know if I can do this without moving the mic, but I'll try and show you. We've got beehives in the garden
Wowza.
here, and like a wood burning oven, and then in the kitchen. The kitchen's not like super fancy, really. It's I've had it redone, but it was a domestic kitchen, so we're not talking, I've not got steam ovens or anything like this. Domestic oven, domestic hob. I've got things like the Thermomix and the water bath and things to make my life easier, but nothing crazy. And then sort of stashed around the place, I have some of I guess, the more unusual bits of equipment, like centrifuge and things like this. But again, most of that for me, for the way that I cook, is my aim really is that when the guests come, that technology shouldn't be apparent, shouldn't really have an influence. What I want to really talk to them about is like the honey from the bees or the spruce that I've foraged for a dessert. It's very, very focused on a lot of natural ingredients, a lot of foraged ingredients, a lot of sort of seasonal wild food stuff, and there's raised beds out in what was our driveway is now covered in raised beds to grow veg out there, and that is where I kind of want people's consciousness to be, is on these fresh ingredients, and that everything else that's around the technology is letting me present those in the best way possible. And the other thing that's really nice with this for me is I feel like it's kept me very passionate and engaged in what I'm doing, because I feel like working with the bees or picking ingredients from the raised beds, or last year I started making bean to bar chocolate here for some of the desserts, and having that focus on having this sort of holistic view of these things has really helped to keep me very kind of passionate about what I'm doing and very engaged kind of across the full scope of it, if that makes sense. And
It totally makes sense, man. Like it's one of the reasons why I think about. I mean, I get the question countless times, like, why don't you have a restaurant yet? And it's like, well, because I know that if I launched a restaurant that had, let's just say, arbitrary 75 seats in it, I would not have that connection to the food that you
Sure.
have.
Yeah,
you know,
the
there would be
volume
so
is
many things.
killer.
Totally, it'd be team managing, it'd be finance meetings, it would be HR, it'd be marketing, it'd be going on a cookbook tour. It'd be like there's so many other things that like I'm doing a pop up in a little under 3 weeks, and it's like. It's just some ideas that I've just been excited to share. I don't have to worry about. I specifically picked a venue that was going to cover the logistics and the ticket sales. I'm renting all of the stuff that I'm going to serve people food on. I'm not pouring a bunch of money into this. It's priced in a way where I'm basically going to break even. It's not going to be a big financial endeavor for me. And I'm not saying that people should not charge, but I guess what the lesson that I'm trying to distill from what you're saying is, I think the reason that you don't have a restaurant in the traditional sense, like a just large scale, massive team, big operation kind of thing, is because it wouldn't resonate with what gets you up and excited out of bed in the morning.
Yeah, I think
Am I right there?
I think that's exactly it. Like I get that same question from people and sometimes even from guests where they'll be like, do you not want to open something bigger? And in part, like I say, because it's so small, because it's 8 covers, that's one of the reasons it sells out so far in advance. And then I get that people are like, people enjoy it, then they're excited, they want to share it with other people, and they want to say, go to this thing. It's difficult to get in. So there's this idea that they, on that side of things, they kind of like the idea of it being like bigger, and you could decide that week you're going to come, but it would not be the same thing. And like you say, the time at the minute, my time is, and there's good days and bad days because of this, but it's spent on, like, I'm making everything from scratch. Like, no one else touches the food. I make from peeling the potatoes, I'm doing that, to distilling the gin. It's for the boring jobs to the exciting stuff, it's all. And that's just, it would not be what it was if I was doing even like 20 covers. Then I would be hiring staff and spending time organizing things. I wouldn't be in the kitchen as much. And there's something cool and unique, I think, about the fact that literally everything the guests get, like, if like I one pair of hands has touched that at every single stage. And again, obviously that's not the only way to do a restaurant, but I really enjoy that.
Do you have additional team members that come in and help with service or beverage?
No,
Nothing.
Just me. I think twice, maybe 3 times my fiance has helped out but this is like over the course of years, like a couple of times where we've done, like, if we've done a private dinner and it's like extra on top of what I'm normally doing, then that's, I pretty much work at my capacity already. So to fit in anything extra, then I might call on her. But no, it's me cooking, serving, washing up, doing everything. So it's hardcore, it's like, it's long days, but it's also incredibly rewarding, and it feels very honest and very, like, involved, and I feel very, very closely connected to everything that I'm doing, which is, for me, that works really well. And again, I'm sure other people would want a totally different relationship with stuff, and but that really suits me.
It's just trade-offs, you know what I mean? Like, you could have this multi-location empire that doesn't require you to be there, or you could, like, I have a trip to Japan coming up in May, and I was watching a tourist video about, like, things you should think about going to Japan, and the host was saying something to the effect of, certain restaurants, you just have to expect that you might just walk up to the door and it'll just say closed today.
Yeah.
Because it is single person hinge point reliant, where it's like, if the chef and owner is not feeling well, or their kid gets sick, or something happens and they aren't able to come in today, the restaurant's closed that day. And that is, that, to your point, that's a downside that you just have to be aware of when you set up your business in this way.
And there's definitely, like, of course, I like to focus on the positives and the romantic side of things. Like, there's certainly times when, like there are times at the end of the weekend where I am, like, hollowed out by the, like I love doing service, and you got the adrenaline and chatting to the guests, and, like, I'm honestly really loving and enjoying it when I'm doing it. But you sometimes get to that next day and it's like a hangover of like just like all of your energy is drained away. And there are times when you think, oh, I would love to just like if a mate says to me, oh, we're doing this thing in 4 weeks' time. If I've got service, I'm not going. You know, there's no one to cover. There's no swapping, or you know, there are days where the jobs that you've got to do are just not fun jobs. You know, they are just boring, repetitive jobs, and there's no one else to do them. The final thing, I guess, the thing that does sometimes frustrate me is because there's so much prep for one person to do. There are times I want to work on a new idea, and I just have to shelf it for the minute because everything has to be ready for service this weekend. So I can't work on this exciting new idea. That'll have to wait sometimes weeks until I've got proper time. But then that's the balance of like any way you choose to work, you're gonna, like you say, you're gonna be trading some of these things off. And in part for me, doing some of the things like the YouTube stuff, I fill some of that gap too, because I can only cook for 8 people a night, but this way some more people can see some of the food that I'm doing than can eat here. Or sometimes maybe I've got an idea and it's not right for the menu, but I think it's interesting or it's cool, and maybe that's a good thing to do for a video. And you know, that I'm finding more and more is like adds an element. And interestingly also now I find for some of the guests, more and more people come and they'll say, oh, we know how you make this. We've seen we've seen the video on this. Like, that's kind of cool, you know, because you can't tell them all that stuff during service, but they could watch a 5 or 10 minute video about how I make the gin before I serve it to them. And that's cool.
Well, what is the difference in relationship that guest feels then towards, in other words, when you have a fine dining concept, you're constantly grappling with this thing called guest expectations. And if all that person has seen is the very overproduced, dramatized chef's table, you know, kind of like perfect cinematography version of that dish, of course that I would argue puts expectations swung too far in a different direction, where it's like, this is magical. I just heard Ruth Reichel sing her praises on the way that this ingredient was treated on this thing. And it's like, there's no way that is going to map to what your expectations are when you sit down at that table and eat that dish. Compare that to having you on camera talk about going out and picking this with your own hands and then coming and developing it. And I tried this 3 different ways and it didn't really work out. I think like this internet version of portraying your food is such a better setup for the guest to have a good time rather than what other forms of food media hype people up with, which ultimately it sucks for all parties involved, right? Because it makes the chef upset that like, oh, well, I'm never going to be able to track to this. And it makes the guest upset. All of it. Yeah,
like you can't bring the food doesn't go down in front of the guests in slow-mo, you know? You can't have this beautiful...
Totally, 120p,
like, you know?
Yeah.
I think the same thing. One of the things I've really enjoyed about that side of things is that, you know, I was talking about like wild food and foraging and stuff, and when I come out and present a dish to the guests, I'm going to tell them this is like they get these little dandelion fruit pastels at the start, and I talk to them a little bit about that stuff, but you can't talk too long. There's 12 courses, you can't go into everything in super detail, and I wouldn't expect all of the guests to watch the videos or anything, but for the odd one that's enthusiastic, they can have seen that, and then they get to see you picking those things and where you've been and how, like, and if they want to see the process, it's there, and that's a nice way that the option is there to kind of take them with you. And even then, I think, you know, even for YouTube videos, they're seeing like a nice finished version that hopefully is matched up when they come here. But it's like 2 different sides of the thing. Like the videos, you get to see as something nicely produced and see this background stuff, but you can't taste the food. And then when you're like sitting down to eat, you get that physical, visceral side of things, and the in the moment, the kind of like the buzz of seeing a band live, you know, like you don't necessarily need them to sound like the CD, but like the energy is different. The CD, God, I'm aging myself there, aren't I? Like, you know.
Totally. But I love the way that you frame that, and I resonate with that a lot. I had the same philosophy when I was doing, you know, dishes on YouTube that I would then serve at a pop-up. It was totally the same philosophy. I have one more question, and then I want to go into rapid fire stuff because I want to make sure we get you out of here on time. We could spend a whole podcast episode on this topic, so I hate that I'm kind of pitching it to you in the end, but why plant-based food?
So when I was studying, I was doing my philosophy degree, and I basically was just like, I was just a poverty-stricken student. You know, I had no money really to spend on food. So when I did buy meat or fish, like, it was just like terrible quality, and the ethics around it must have been like awful. You know, this and I remember sort of just very consciously thinking about that at one point and being like, you should not be eating this like stuff. Like this is not good. Not necessarily that I shouldn't be eating meat or fish, but I was just like, you shouldn't be eating that stuff. Like this is not good welfare stuff. And there wasn't really, and like I couldn't afford good versions of things. And I was probably eating a lot of vegetarian stuff anyway because of that. But so I thought, well, I'll go fully vegetarian and we'll just see. And that extra little jump, the same time as I was sort of working in these kitchens like part-time to pay my way through, all of that fed into me cooking more. And I was suddenly like, oh, there's this extra little challenge that like back in like my student flat, I'm like, cool, I want to learn how to make, I don't know, like very studenty stuff. So like Indian food and like, lots of one pot things. But like, I was very excited about cooking and very excited about like simple cooking and learning to do more of that for myself. And it really suited me. And then I think it's sort of serendipity that stuff happened before I'd kind of committed to being a professional chef like long term. So it sort of stuck with me. And, like we were saying at the start, initially I was like, well, I'm going to give this a go for a year or 2 years. And those first restaurants I was working in served meat and fish, but a lot of it was like, a lot of it was cooking things to order and like, either the chefs would be pretty good at working around me or would be like, you can cook something to a doneness by like, you're not having to taste it to get that right. And to be honest, so long as you were like, the restaurants I was in, people would often like ask how you kind of got through those environments. But if you could keep up with the pace of service and do what needed to be doing, no one cared if you were a vegetarian. They were just like, is the job getting done? Are the things getting ticked off the list? Is the food going out like cooked right and fast enough? So it was once I've been doing that for a few years that then I found like a couple of plant-based places to work here, which were not super fancy, but it meant I could pursue that a little more. And so it just suited me, and like a lot of things didn't happen like in this super thought through way. And I'm obviously not evangelical about it because of course working in kitchens all the time, like loads of my I'm not surrounded like by, although obviously the level of plant-based stuff has just exploded over the past few years, but I'm not going around telling everyone they should be vegan or anything. Like it just sort of suited me and like fitted well. And then oddly, like kind of it's one of the things that pushed me towards like looking at other techniques. And like I remember when I went to Madrid Fusion, this big like gastronomy conference, and I saw Grant Achatz talk there and Ferran Adria and like these people explaining what they were doing at their, and that period of time, those are the times where you would find out what was happening in these huge like sort of superstar restaurants. And it just seemed like so much of what they were doing that was interesting was kind of happening with stuff that was plant-based anyway. It was like, or the elements that were, and got me more interested in that. And again, that kind of spiraled. I would get deeper and deeper into this stuff. And it also just seemed to me at that time that I was like, there's all this potential there that doesn't seem like it's being fully explored. Like there's more that can be done here. And now I feel quite lucky that like, that sort of again accidentally became my sort of niche that I'm in. But yeah, it sort of suited me really. I've had a lot of sort of happy accidents really over the years.
Well, and just the timing and the interest behind something that already has a wave building behind it is going to be nothing but beneficial, especially with talking about making content, or maybe it's like the education gap that you have to fill with people, where if you were doing something that was, I don't know, I can't even bring something to mind that is just like so cutting edge that people just don't even quite understand it yet. I find that is often the wrong way to position your project, because it's like you have such a hurdle that you have to overcome to get people to even wrap their head around what is it that this guy does. But with all of the stuff that's been building, people understand what a plant-based menu is. And so you can just lean into blowing their minds versus, okay, guys, so you know how we always have protein in our meals? Well, just so you know. Like,
yeah, I don't have to break
yeah.
it to them that this is like, oh, there's this other option. And do you know, one of the things that I found really interesting is like, certainly, I mean, I guess I don't really have a way of knowing on the other stuff that I put out there, but in terms of guests that come to the tasting menu, probably 90% or more like aren't vegetarian or vegan. Like they are,
Yep.
like, they're just,
Yep.
they're really into food. It either doesn't matter to them that this is plant-based, they're coming because of a recommendation or the reputation or something, or they're coming because they're like, oh, I kind of want to see what you can do with this plant-based stuff, or I'm interested on that front. And like, if anything, the plant-based community and vegetarian and vegan community has been like, well, I suppose it's not always necessarily so like, what I'm doing is relatively special. Anything where you're doing tasting menus and stuff, like you're at a more luxury end of things, like it's not what like people are necessarily focused on, especially if they are thinking about making a diet change or something like that. They're more thinking, well, what am I going to buy for my shopping this week, or what am I going to cook for tonight? Like, but yeah, it's kind of that's been kind of cool. I quite like that like a lot of the time I'm not really mentioning that much that it's plant-based because it's just sort of incidental. And yeah,
Let's do some rapid fire ones. So I'm curious if there is an ingredient that you're either super stoked on right now, or you think, well, this exists and people don't use it enough. And so the question is, name an ingredient you're obsessed with right now.
okay, all the time I'm obsessed with dandelion petals. Like they're amazing. The flavor is incredible as like once you infuse it into things. And again, I just don't see people using it that much. You get dandelions growing wild in the US as well, right?
100%,
Like,
all over the place.
It's delicious. You can eat every part of the dandelion. It's like, I don't know why, like, yeah, don't know why it's not more used. It's awesome.
And I guess for the listener, what are some of your favorite ways? You have a couple videos on your channel, which we'll link down in the show notes. But I guess, can you give just like a quick favorite use case?
Yeah. So the course I have at the very start of the menu is this dandelion petal fruit pastel. So it's made like a pâté de fruits, like a pectin set, like pastel. I cold infuse dandelion petals to make it essentially like a dandelion petal cordial. So I do that each spring. Then I can batch that cordial for the full year, make these little pastels from it, and I top them with lemon verbena leaves, which we grow in the raised beds. So it's a little one bite thing that's very refreshing, especially with just a fresh lemon verbena leaf on top. And it's a nice introduction to the menu as well, to say to people, this is growing all around. You all know this plant. You all see it all around you. It's considered a weed, and we're going to start off with this. And the idea is that matches the flavors in the homemade gin and tonic that I give them as well. Because when I make the gin, I use verbena in that, and I top the gin and I make a grapefruit tonic water, make this lemon verbena gin, and then I top it with a little bit of this same dandelion infusion, just lightly aerated in the whipper, so you just get a little hint of that there. And that idea is that's the introduction to the menu, is kind of like setting your stall out a little bit, you know, and sort of saying, we're going to have this kind of fancy clever stuff, but we're also going to have this like wild food and almost like kind of trash ingredients that you know.
Sure. So I have this obsession with helping hospitality professionals build their repertoire. That's why I named this company and the show this. And so I ask all my guests towards the end of the show, as kind of like people can bounce around from episode to episode and get a little bit of a taste of different people's most loved skill sets. And so I'm curious for you, what is the most valuable part of your repertoire?
Yeah, that's interesting. Like as in like an individual skill that you would say that you come back to a lot.
Yeah.
I think one of the most unusual things that I do, so one of the things that's fairly unique to what I do, I think is probably the use of vacuum distillation. That's partly because the technology is prohibitive to a lot of people, and then the information out there is fairly limited as well. So even if you have the technology, it's quite a steep learning curve. And for me, yeah, I think that's a good example, because the ways that I use that are to isolate flavors, and it's all about like clarity. Like, so I'm using this fairly high-tech stuff, but really to do very simple stuff to either distill something so I get its pure flavor, and the whole reason I want to do that at low temperature is just to keep that flavor as pure as possible, or like we spoke about before, using it the same technology the other way around to make these reductions, concentrate flavors, but without ever heating them up, so you can get these hyper concentrated reductions of a single ingredient, like, but just like you've turned the volume up on it to 100, you know. And that I think is a good example of how I often like to look at food, because I like to use like, you know, it takes a lot of like, there's a lot of rejected ideas along the way with those things. You know, to do something simple is often the hardest thing, but then if you can really nail something, there's a rhubarb reduction that I make using this that is just like consistently is a winner. And things like that I think are a good, like that's often my favorite stuff, I think, and it's something that's fairly unique to what I do.
Is there a book, whether this is creativity, aesthetics, business, that's been particularly impactful for you in your journey so far?
Yeah, I suspect it has aged a little bit now because I haven't looked at it in a while, but I distinctly remember after seeing Grant talk at Madrid Fusion that like I hadn't come across Alinea before. Maybe it hadn't even been open that long. It might have been open a year or two or something, and the news hadn't, you know, internet wasn't at the same level, you know, the social media wasn't at the same level and stuff over there. I saw him talk, and then his cookbook was on sale there as well, and just had a quick flick through, and that Alinea cookbook, I'd just never seen anything like it. And like I had the Fat Duck cookbook and stuff like that here, so I was not new to the to like some of the techniques, and nitrogen and things like that weren't like, you know, I wasn't mind blown by that, but like the presentation and the like, that was like a light bulb moment where you're like, oh, food can be this. Like it doesn't have, like food could kind of be anything you want it to be. You could push these ideas like that. You know, I'm not sure it would be the one that I would recommend for people now. Like it is going back a little bit, but at the time it was just like, that was like a lifting of a veil or something where you're like,
yeah,
wow.
It was paradigm. That was one of the first books I picked up when I got into culinary school, and I had the same exact experience. Like food can be this.
Yeah.
Holy cow! And after that, it's kind of like you can't unsee it. Like I just became committed to wanting to work there in some capacity.
Did you ever go and work it?
Yeah. So I was really committed to doing my culinary school externship there. So the way that my school worked is we did a year of school and then a 6-month externship and then another year of school. And I went and staged there, and you know, the story goes I had a horrible experience. Like the first thing that anybody ever said when I walked in was don't talk to me. And so I was like, oh, this is like really harsh. And then I was doing a project and I ended up cutting my hand doing a project. And so I had to like it was a 2-day stage, and I had to cut the second day a bit short. Right. I knew I wasn't going to get the job offer, and you know, I really didn't like the environment anyways, and so yeah, I ended up going to Per Se instead as like a plan B, which was funny that Per Se was my plan B, because like holy cow. But yeah, I got reconnected again because I was on the opening team of this restaurant called Grace in Chicago. And Curtis Duffy was the chef of that project, and then he was like a sous chef at Alinea too, so I got a lot of those techniques kind of instilled.
Did you find, how was the environment at Grace? Was that then, like, was it
very similar?
Right.
Very similar, but the team was smaller, and so there wasn't as much room for, again, my Axis thing that I was talking about earlier. Sure. It was just a little bit more of an intimate team, and I was a chef de partie. Like I was an opening chef de partie. Sure. I had a station, and so contrast that with being an extern at Alinea, where you're just subject to washing leaks or sealing things in cryovac bags or making sodium alginate spheres. It's like there's a little bit of a different sense of responsibility, and so I think that's why I had a better experience at Grace versus Alinea.
Do you know, I'm really glad in retrospect that I couldn't. I remember looking at the Alinea book and then being like, well, I've got to try and get there, and I was looking at ways that I could like fund. I just basically couldn't make it work financially to get myself across to America and like to stage. And I'm now really glad, because I think from what I've like heard, and this isn't anything to take away from the level of creativity and stuff like that, but I don't think it would have been an environment for me. Like I say, I would never like the strongest, fastest cook in the kitchen. I was competent, but I was like, I think I would have maybe gone thinking this is going to be incredible, I've built this up in my head, and then had a horrible experience, and it might have just totally changed my relationship with that very inspiring. I'm glad that I kind of left it on a pedestal and didn't let reality interfere with it, you know.
Totally. That's a very self-aware statement. You somehow get a call right after this interview that you've just won an all-expenses-paid trip to eat at your dream restaurant. And when you get there, there's someone you've always wanted to talk with waiting to have dinner with you. What is that restaurant, and who is that person?
Wow. Okay. God, that's hard to swallow. Okay, so I would probably go back across to Copenhagen. It's kind of too obvious an answer. And either either go back to Noma, because that was just incredible, or Alchemist, which
Yep.
also looks amazing.
You haven't been to Alchemist yet?
No, no.
Yeah,
So
I mean,
maybe I need to pick that, because that's like that looks like Alinea felt, when it was sort of breaking through all those boundaries, and I mean it's still breaking through boundaries, I'm sure, but like Alchemist is kind of like new, and I mean it looks insane. It looks really cool. Who would I eat with? Maybe it would be better for it to be like someone from outside of the industry. Like at the moment, I've got very interested in film photography recently. It might be nice for like I really like this photographer Alex Soth, who does this like large format, very sort of artistic work. I think that's very much of the moment. That's because that's what like right now I'm interested in. Like if you ask me next week, it'd probably be totally different. But like he seems really interesting, and it would be cool to share an experience like that. Perhaps it would stop you getting too analytical about it, to share it with someone that isn't in the industry.
well, I think having a creative experience with someone who is equally as creative, but in a separate discipline from what your experiences or what you're potentially experiencing is always fun, because they're like, oh, well, this reminds me of blank. Like the conversations in those types of dinners are always spot on.
Yeah, like a musician, or especially something where I think you've got
Exactly.
like this relationship that's similar to food, where it's this mix of like craft and creativity. Like you have to master a certain level of a craft before you can get creative with it. And I think music, photography, things like that, like have that same relationship. Like you can't just jump in and be like, I'm gonna do something crazy and creative. Like you have to learn a certain skill set first and get to a level, and then this interesting stuff starts. Like, I think I relate a lot to those things.
What can chefs be doing better to help the next generation? And that's kind of going to be the last question that I present to you here.
Would you know, one of the things that I really hope, I don't know exactly how this happens, I think the environmental stuff is improving. It kind of almost goes without saying, I would hope that we want to keep improving on that. But
And you're talking about like the kitchen culture, or you're talking about like environment?
well, there I'm talking about, I suppose, the environment, like the outside, the world around us, and ecology and stuff. But the thing that I think I would pick to say that people should focus on that, but the thing I still don't see quite enough focus on, I think, yet, is the other type of environment that we're talking about, and is like kitchen culture and how people are treated. You shouldn't have had an experience like the one you were just describing, like a young cook going into somewhere, and like, it could change your relationship with that entire industry. People have some horrible experiences. I broadly believe it's getting better broadly, but there's too much of like stuff still goes on. I recently heard about like just some horrible stuff happening in restaurants around here, even, that are like, it you should be able to go in and expect, you should be treated like you would be treated in another job, I think, really. Like, if it would not be like, you would expect to be fired and not work in the industry again if you like physically hurt someone in another job, intentionally like physically hurt someone or abuse them or something. Like how it's just accepted still in some areas is mad to me. And like ultimately it can't be it's not sustainable. Younger people aren't going to want to go into that environment, or they're going to go in and they're going to see people leaving the industry. So yeah, how we push that, I think it's just by doing it, by making nicer environments, by making people more accountable. But I would love to see, I think with things like the Michelin Green Stars and things, you can see like bigger institutions starting to get to grips with the environmental like state of the world stuff. I don't know how that becomes integrated into how people are treated, but I think you probably need something external for that too, as that extra push, like, or a way that restaurants can say, we're a responsible employer, that we have this award for like how, not even necessarily how well we treat our staff, but the fact that we can certify we don't treat them horribly,
Yeah, that's an interesting point, because when you make Michelin stars the one metric you're trying to optimize for, everything comes at the expense of that one goal.
Yeah.
And you're right, it comes at the staff happiness, abuse that happens, pay, tons of waste. It's the common dilemma that other businesses run into, where it's like, if you're going to optimize for XYZ metric, and that's going to be the only thing that anybody's incentivized to push for, of course other things are going to fall by the wayside.
Yeah, and it's such a pity that it's like, for it to be people that are the heart of the industry, and that you need, like, if you're doing if you're doing anything more than a handful of covers, you need people. You really need to retain them. So it's kind of shooting yourself in the foot, right? If you have like staff turnover
100%.
and you can't train people up and keep them in that business, and it's this weird hangover from a previous time. There's of course there's all these other factors. It's not solely the fault of like the restaurant industry. There's all these other conversations about like how much people pay for food and see it as worth, and what level of respect it has as like a line of work, and all of these things. But it's definitely, that feels like where there's the space for the biggest revolution to come to me. Like, you know, I'm sure it's a big part of the reason that lots of people, including I'm sure lots of your listeners, are wanting to do things that aren't just traditional restaurants, because either you don't want to continue being in that environment for forever, or you want to start your own thing and you want to create a positive environment, and it feels difficult to perhaps do in those traditional spaces.
Eddie, you and I have been, just kind of gently messaging on Instagram, but this was really awesome to learn more about you and what you do, and to spend this time together. Has there been anything that we've talked about that you want to just continue on, or maybe a final word for the listener?
I don't know. I mean, I'm intrigued. What do you think? What sort of questions do you get through? Do you think is there anything particular you think it would be?
Yeah, I think that there's a lot of questions on creativity, confidence, how to, I mean, from your experience specifically in pop-ups, I guess like productivity in pop-ups, maybe how you go about just like organizing your day to make sure that everything gets set up on time, and
Sure.
and all of those little nitty-gritty details that like I don't think other shows talk about. Like,
Yeah.
I have my notes here. We didn't ask you anything literally about ingredients until probably like 50 minutes into the
Sure.
conversation. So like I call myself a food podcast, but it's really so much about the other things that I think can help downstream of creativity of food, because
Yeah.
if you know that you can get set up on time, you can go for that more ambitious presentation. Whereas
Yeah.
people who start with, okay, we're going to do this really cool, like the green apple balloon's a perfect example.
Sure,
like
sure.
there are horror stories of executing that for 80 people a night at Alinea,
Yeah.
because like it was ideas first.
Yeah, yeah.
And so that's what the listener nerds out on. So I guess anything there?
Cool. Well, that's kind of a good thing to talk about, I think, because it, like you say, it's kind of in the industry. It's not the sort of thing you'd necessarily get to just like chat about, but like things like organization wise, particularly working on my own, like I have to organize the death out of things. Like, they have to be. So I use an app called Things on my phone.
Yeah.
That
Yes.
links. Are you familiar with it? Yeah. So,
Yeah.
that links across everything. I have an iPad that is stuck on the fridge in the kitchen. Yeah, so that is synced with my phone, synced with my computer. All of my prep lists, and not just prep lists, but to-dos there are some things that are daily, there are some things that are set for the days that I'm open. They're all automated to repeat. All my orders are put into
Smart.
those. It's just like,
Smart.
my aim is for there to be more stuff in that than I need. For it to be like I'm trying to idiot-proof it against my own idiocy, I'm trying to make sure there's like, I can't miss something. So stuff that I know to do every single day is still on the list, and you tick it off. Yeah, so I have different lists, like mise en place lists, like timings in there. Like, I guess that built up over time. I used to have physically written out prep lists, then I had like a notes app that had them in, and then at some point I basically spent like a day transferring that stuff across and setting up all these repeating things. But that has been invaluable in terms of the investing that time to get that stuff set up. And of course that's a bit different for me because I have regular services and a regular menu that's sort of slowly changing. But it's another thing, like we were talking about, some basic camera skills, like some finding a program or an app or a system that works for you in terms of organization. I mean, maybe that's paper for people, but I would suggest that if you can digitize stuff like in some reliable way, that's extremely useful. And that perhaps leads into what you were mentioning about creativity as well, of like, if you want to leave yourself room to be creative, you need to get everything else out of the way that you can. So if you can nail down, you don't want to be thinking about, did I order this, or does this need ordering for tomorrow, and like, is this the day that I should prep this thing, or like, you want to free up your time to be creative. I expect the other thing that I did that's with all my recipes is, so I have all of them synced to the cloud so I can get them on my phone, on my iPad, but the things that I'm making all of the time, I created like a PDF for myself, like, so it's essentially a little non-published cookbook, like of a working cookbook.
Smart.
But because it's a PDF, like, you can open it. Like I don't have to open even a document. It's there in, because I'm using Apple for everything, it's there in iBooks. I open that up, that's the first thing that comes up. I can scan through it like super quickly. So those things are like, these are the things that would be like, guests don't care about any of that stuff. But in terms of actually how helpful it is, it's more helpful than like, it's more helpful than me talking to them about like the ultrasonic bath for infusion or something. Like if I have to pick between the two, I need the Notes app more than I need the ultrasonic bath, like that's the thing that's
100%. Well, I mean, that's the with all this talk on AI, that's the conversation that's happening where it's like, oh, AI is going to take our whatever. And it's like, well, it's not that AI is going to take it. It's that a human using technology is going to come in and potentially be able to do it better than you.
Sure.
And as people might hear you talking about, you're doing 12-course tasting menus for 8 people a night and you're doing all the prep yourself. It's like, of course, there are these underlying support structures that you lean on to make sure that you can execute.
Yeah, you have to. Like it's the same way. Like some of the things that I use in the kitchen, I'm using almost purely because they enable my hands to be elsewhere and doing something else. So the Thermomix, the reason I like that as a blender is because it is big and heavy. Like I do sometimes use its temperature controls. There are certain things I'm using that for, but mostly it's that it's not like a Vita mix. I don't have to stand there and hold it while it goes. I can set that blending and walk away. Or the water bath, when I use it during service, I'm really using it for hot holding at a set temperature. And there's a lot of things like that where I'm using this technology that really has better capabilities, fancier things. But if those sorts of things mean I can walk away and do something else and know that thing is left, like, and that's the same for like prep lists, like anything that I can like sort of outsource to a I can't outsource to another person, so I outsource to a thing or to an app. And again, that's bleak for anyone doing things like pop-ups and stuff like that. Like if you can spend that time to get systems in place, you will really reap the benefits of that later. Like I bet when you're doing your pop-ups, you're not like a couple of days before just getting a notebook out and starting like scribbling out orders and stuff. Like,
no, I'm such a Notion fiend, and I use Notion. I'm familiar with things. I've used it before, but I do drawings on an iPad to make sure that the people I'm working with, because I don't do everything by myself. I hire people, but yeah, it's like, why not modernize? The way that I go about it is, what are the frequently experienced headaches that I have?
Yeah.
And so one example might be, I pass a couple of trays up because I've just finished cooking something, and the person that I've hired says, how are we going to plate this? And I'm like, facepalm emoji. I'm like, oh, I didn't even tell them how I'm going to do this. So I was like, how can I overcome that? I can use technology to sketch it out, send them an email of the sketch before the pop-up, and then when they get that pork passed to them, it's like, oh, I know exactly how Justin wants this done.
Yeah.
And so that, for a pop-up environment, is so much more beneficial, because in a restaurant, they can just stand there on their stage and watch you plate that. Yeah. But it's like, in a pop-up, this is the first time this dish has ever been plated by me. So it's like, how are we going to overcome that?
Yeah. Yeah, you're totally right. And I think like being familiar with some tools that are going to like help you with that stuff. Also, that all feeds through into the future. Even if someone's doing pop-ups because they want to then open a restaurant and stuff, like you are not going to regret learning a good additional organizational skills, like, or, even boring stuff like using like, how are you doing the financial side of things and like keeping notes on this stuff, like, but that stuff is boring. It's not the creative, fun stuff you want to be doing. But then if it takes you twice as long to do when you have to do it because you don't have a good system, then that's taking away from the time that you could be being creative, or you could be out, like picking wild ingredients or things like this, or like, and there's so much of the technology like in our pockets on phones that's immediately helpful for this. Like, that like when the guys from Noma were going out and foraging, and they would drop pins where like different things were and stuff.
Interesting.
And like, like, and again, like, why say to someone, oh, it was sort of near this thing? It's like, no, it's pinned on a map. You can find this thing.
Yep. Well, listen, man, I'm getting self-conscious that I'm keeping you a little too long, but clearly we could keep going. So maybe we'll have to do a round two in the future.
It's a pleasure talking, man.
Yeah, likewise. Where do you want people to go find you and follow what you're working on?
Probably the easiest place for people to find me is YouTube, I guess, because I have a website and I have social media and stuff like that, but all of that stuff is linked under all of the YouTube videos. So that's probably a nice, easy place for people to like see where I am and quickly see some of what I'm up to, and like, yeah.
Cool.
So if they search Eddie Shepherd, I mean, honestly, if they Google Eddie Shepherd, they'll get some of my stuff coming up, I think.
Right. Well, thanks so much for coming on the show, man. This has been awesome.
Oh, it's a pleasure, man.
Well, here we are together again at the end of another episode of the Repertoire Podcast. If this is your first time listening, this is a show for hospitality creators who want to think better, increase their performance, and believe that it's possible to take lessons from what others have already learned. I am your host, Justin Khanna, and if you're new here, I'd like to personally welcome you to the show. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Friendly heads up to check out the show notes inside of the description of this podcast if you want to check out previous guests, links to specifics that got brought up in this episode, as well as other helpful content that we create and share here online, because everything we do is focused on helping you along your journey. If you don't have a ton of time, the best place to start is with some value sent straight to your inbox every single week. It's called the Repertoire Newsletter, where we share knowledge on sharpening your skills, asymmetric upside, and exploring the industry beyond the status quo. If you subscribe, we'll keep you up to date on trends that are shaping the hospitality creator ecosystem. We'll share discounts on gear that we find, as well as content that we've been producing ourselves and helpful articles that we've already read and decided are worth your time. Last up, if you want to connect with other industry professionals in the Repertoire Pro community, you want to check out courses like Total Station Domination, or download free tools that we've created, you can learn more at joinrepertoire.com. That's JoinRepertoire.com. The only ask from me is that if you enjoyed this episode, I'd really appreciate a review of this show on Apple Podcasts as well as Spotify to help the podcast universe know that people like us like shows like this. Regardless, I'll see you in the next episode. My name is Justin Khanna, and I hope you have a good one.